Greetings, human beings, and welcome back to Apartment 303, a podcast for community fans. My name is Dave, and alongside my co-host Dan, we are here to discuss all things community, each and every layer of the show, and why we love it so much. Joining us today at Apartment 303 is our former co-host and community expert extraordinaire, Adam. Welcome to the show. What have you been up to, my friend?
I am glad to be back. I'll tell you that. It's like every March, you can count on Dick Vitale to be around for college basketball, and you can count on me to be around for community brackets.
I am very excited. Dan, How have you been, my friend? What have you been up to?
I've been doing well. Have some things going on out here. I did officially sign with a commercial agency, so that's fun. Hopefully I'll start booking some commercials out here in LA soon, but that was the huge thing. Outside of that, I was in my car loving my wife.
Okay, I'm going to give that a 10 out of 10. I'm so excited to have the both of you here today. You know, our listeners will know this is our new co-host and our former co-host, and it's all coming together in the best way possible today. So on today's episode, we are going to be discussing bracketology once again. A year ago, we went as deep as you could probably go into the bracketology of this show with all of the different regions for all of the different seasons, eventually crowning a champion. And now we have Dan here as well, who has independently done his own bracketology project regarding the show community. So today we are bringing all of those things together, and instead of ranking the episodes against one another, which we did last year, we're going to be discussing, debating, hashing it all out regarding various different relationships in this show. The idea was to kind of define each region based off one type of relationship. So let's go ahead and get things kicked off here. Would you say that your lasting impression has been with the romantic relationships or the rivalries?
So I think given the nature of the show and how it was, and this is another thing that definitely benefits how the show was kind of structured, I think there's more of an emphasis on the conflict, because when you start and you have 7 core characters, obviously changing in the later seasons, but you have those 7 core characters with already such strong and developed personalities, like from the word go. Like, it was a little bit with the romantic with Jeff and Britta, but then you got really quickly into conflicts, be it with Chang, be it with the Dean, be it with Pierce. And I think that's one of the things that the show definitely benefited from, whether they were mini arcs or large arcs throughout the whole seasons, which is why I think it's interesting too that you can bring up these conversations and kind of how you had that wink and a nod in the romantic aspects for like the Jeff and the Annie relationship, where they were shipping it so much that they actually threw a nod to a YouTube video into the fake clip show, which worked really well. And they had to like reach out to the person who made that YouTube video. Like, they're like, hey, we love this. Could you mind if we throw it up on the show? And I'm sure that person was over the moon about it. So it's funny to me that like, and I think Dan Harmon even said at one point that the way they structured the group was that so there could be a romantic connection with any of them. Haha, even Pierce, because they talk about it in one of the early episodes. But I think the show really shines when you have a lot more of the conflict as opposed to the romantic relationships.
I couldn't agree more. And that's what sets it apart from other sitcoms, too, Most, maybe apart from Seinfeld, because here I am at the age 34 finally watching through it for the first time. It's really unique to see a de-emphasis on relationships. And obviously Community and Seinfeld do that in different ways. But as we were brainstorming and trying to pick out these relationship pairings, be they adversarial, rivalry, or romantic, there was just a much longer and more compelling list for rivalries, I thought. And I kept thinking of other ones, even as I was trying to put things together for the other brackets. And in some ways, it's kind of a shame that we have to limit it on the rivalries. And Dan, I know you had recommended revisiting this topic later because it's really a rich well from which to draw.
Oh yeah, we had a list. I think this a little baby spoiler ahead, but these are going to be 1 versus 8, like 8 different options. I think that list was pushing 40, if I remember correct, like 40 different.
Yeah,
options.
So for most of the regions, we brainstormed maybe between 16 and 24 options. So 2 to 3 times the amount of seedings we're actually going to put in the tournament. But for the rivalry list specifically, we had, upwards of 40 or 50. It was a formatting nightmare on the spreadsheet, for sure.
Kept making the borders wider so they.
It just, I kept trying to make it nicer, and it wasn't happening. However, we landed with 8, and more so than any other region, I think the rivalry region is the one where there were so many more options than the one we included. So that is a great place from which to start. Let's start with the rivalry region. Before we get into the individual matchups, now that you guys have seen the bracket, we have to start with the bubble talk, right? Mm-hmm. Which rivalries did I not include? And we can't blame IMDb this year. This is definitely on me. Which rivalries did I not include that should have made it?
Ooh,
who were the bubble snubs in this region?
First of all, bubble snub needs to be in the lexicon.
I'm really glad that happened. It came up organically.
Yeah. The first one that comes to my mind, because it's the first one I wrote, and it's the one that's my favorite, and that's that's not a surprise to anyone at this point, is Annie Edison versus Annie Kim. Just my favorite.
So it's great, and I'm so glad that you bring that up, because as I was going into this list, like I said, we brainstormed many different options for all these regions. However, in this one, with so many options, I found myself in the situation where I had to find some criteria from which to make a decision. And what I kind of landed on was really giving favor to rivalries that had a recurring aspect. So not just like one-offs, things that happened at least more than once in the show, if not many times. So that definitely was something that I gave a lot of weight to when I was seeding this bracket. And I think that comes up specifically with your bubble snub, because as much as that was a great peak in terms of rivalries, it was a one-off for me.
Oh, I agree. I mean, she does come back and takes the role of Daniel LaRusso in season 6. But that was almost an afterthought. So I completely understand that. The other one that I had my eye on that I thought was really interesting, and again, it could really merit its own episode altogether, was Jeff versus Alan. I thought Rob Corddry's character was really well done, introduced in season 2, if I'm not mistaken, where Jeff and Alan, a.k.a. Tango and Cash, a.k.a. the litter bugs because they put so much trash back out on the street. It's just a really interesting relationship that they have, and it's a great way to showcase how Jeff has changed by coming to Greendale in, I think, some really good, compelling, yet also funny ways. So that's another one that I thought, it's interesting with Alan not being in the Greendale 7, just kind of a fun way to have sort of an outsider who played a pretty prominent arc in season 2.
It was, baby fact check, it was Tango and Sundance.
You're right. You're correct.
Because Cash is played by Joe Latruglio, who I really wish we would have gotten more of him.
Yeah, which that just came back. Is that's 5 or 6, right?
Joe Latruglio?
5-1, I think.
Yeah, I think it's 5.
No, it's I thought it was 4. I thought he popped up at the end, because 5
right.
is when Jeff is down on his luck, and it starts off with the commercial.
I was streets behind.
And then you get Alan coming back. So Alan pops up a few times. I definitely second the thing about Alan, because I think, and we discussed it on the last episode, where one of my favorite episodes of the series all time is that season 3 finale. One of the reasons it works is because you get Alan just being he's such a good shithead villain. Like, he's the perfect shithead villain to come in, but he's totally self-aware, like, oh, just sucking on that vitamin P teat, like, just so funny.
There is no struggle with within his character whatsoever.
No, and like even when Jeff's doing that big monologue, like, oh, Alan wanted me to sell out my client just so Pierce could get it, and he just sits there and he like nods, like, oh yeah, that's true, that's what's happening right here.
I think that would have been my 9. That would have been the first relationship on the outside looking in for me. So it was very much in the thought process. I think ultimately I decided to include 1 or 2 other rivalries that I just felt had a unique angle on discussing various aspects of the show. So that is definitely one that I think is very much should have and very much was in contention to be involved in here.
There were a couple that I was thinking of. I don't know who came up with the very meta one of Dan Harmon versus Sony.
That was definitely Adam's idea.
I smiled at that one. I had a couple of interesting ones that I threw out. I liked some of the ones that were like the group versus everyone. Like I threw out Ass Crack Bandit. I like whoever threw out the study group versus Gilbert and versus Todd. And actually one that just popped up that we won't get to talk about, but the study group versus Chang would have been really interesting as well. Because Chang pops up where he's adversarial to almost everyone on the show at one point or another. And so there would be a lot there as well, especially when you get to the end of that season 3 arc where he's more or less a warlord. So there's some there. I think we're going to talk about a lot of the ones that I was really excited for. So, and because a lot of the other ones we brainstormed, like Alan was a good one. I did a very meta one as well where I said study group versus themselves, because there's a lot going on there about how they kind of get in their own way. And like sometimes they're definitely their own worst enemy. And I think it's the second clip show where it shows all of them and kind of how they've painted themselves to be the heroes of the story, but like anytime they're trying to get in the study room, Garrett's like, I signed out this room. Like, yeah, there's just an interesting conversation to be had there as well.
So I definitely, the biggest struggle, and I'm so glad we started with this region because it definitely was the most difficult, not only the most massive in terms of potential options, but the most difficult when it's almost like there were several different subcategories in this region that the other regions didn't have. I loved the meta suggestions that you guys came up with while we were brainstorming. There were so many, Jeff versus himself, Pierce versus every character versus themselves, right? That is one of the best parts of the show, is that every character is really flawed. And at least for the main, the Reindale 7, that's explored in depth. And even for a couple of the side characters, 2 of which appear very strongly in this region, Chang and Dean Pelton. But yeah, it was really hard to weed out the meta suggestions. I loved the Dan Harmon versus Sony thing, and as soon as I saw that, I thought, A, genius, B, that needs to be its own separate episode. I decided to include Britta versus her parents as the 8 seed, and I want to start here because the way I have this seeded, Britta versus her parents is the 8 seed, so a substantial underdog, because there are only 8 relationships in this bracket, so that is the lowest seed. And in the first round, that relationship is going up against the relationship of Pierce versus the study group. Adam, kick this off for us. What do you think about this matchup?
First of all, Martin Mull as Britta's dad, phenomenal.
Brilliant.
And it works so well with how the character of Britta is developed, because in season 1 she's a strong, independent, maybe off-putting to some people. I really liked her in season 1, and then she later on kind of becomes this fumbling, bumbling feminist that gets it wrong as often as she gets it right. And it is really comedically satisfying to watch what seems like 2 really normal and supportive parents, and Britta just can't have them. And it's one of the best parts of season 6 for my money.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I totally agree. I love the Britta versus their parents. Martin Mull and Leslie Ann Warren, I believe that's the woman who plays her mom as well, because one of my favorite movies growing up and to this day is Clue. So anytime you're going to throw in 2 actors from there, and they both also pop up in Sykes' Clue homage, which is, I know, right? Good for them. But like what you were saying, and as you were recounting Britta's kind of arc, I forget who says, I think it might have been Annie, where it was like, you started off as an eclectic anarchist. How did you turn into the group's airhead? and I think she says thank you. I can't remember the exact line, but it's acknowledged in the show. So I think it's a great realization as well that I like, and this is something that when you were doing Dave, I like that you picked. This was a good thing to pull from season 6 too, because I think you did a good job of like not only doing individual rivalries but also kind of doing a large swath over all of the seasons, because it could be very easy to stick in those first 3 because they're so much longer. So but yeah, Britta versus her parents, it's a super fun dynamic, especially because it's like her perception versus their perception, and then the outside world, and then everyone else in the study group being kind of like
completely on board with her parents, like the best. And all the other characters, well, most of the characters, we do get some sort of, to varying degrees, insight into a relationship with either their father or their mother. However, Britta is the one situation where we are presented with her parents as a collective, right? And that all being said, it is fun as we all are with the relationship. This is the 8 seed, right? And it's going up against Pierce versus the study group. So who advances?
For me, it's Pierce versus the study group. That may be the single defining characteristic of relationships within Community that sets it so far apart from other sitcoms and other television in general. I can't come up with another show where one of the primary characters becomes a villain. And again, the closest thing I come up with is Newman from Seinfeld. And yeah, I've been watching too much Seinfeld lately, but that's not even close. It doesn't compare because he's added several seasons in, and this just completely uproots the foundation of the study group. And I'll save it maybe for next round, assuming it moves on. But I know that Dan Harmon had some very specific things to say about why this relationship was so impressive to see it come to fruition.
I mean, if you're being the tiebreaker about in general, I think you can go ahead and save it on this one, because I'm 100% in the same boat, that Pierce versus the study group. And I'll go a little advanced because you're saving something for later on. I've actually thought about this for a few years, and however many countless times I've rewatched the show, but to me, Pierce is the best character in the first 3 seasons. He has the best story arc. He goes from being a bumbling old man to a straight up villain to being very redeemed by season 3. And I think you don't get a lot of the great arcs in the first 3 seasons of the show if you don't have Pierce going through that journey he does and being a foil for pretty much every character at some point or another. So yeah, this was one seeding you got 100% right. I think Pierce versus the study group advances over Britta versus her parents easily. Sure, it's fun to talk about Britta versus her parents, but in my mind, they didn't have a chance in hell against this one.
Yeah, it seems like the one was definitely right, although having sussed this all out, I am starting to feel like maybe I underseeded Britta versus her parents. So let's talk about the other episodes before we get too far into recency bias. So before we get into the 2s and the 3s, because of the nature of seeding, we're going to talk about the 4 versus the 5. So theoretically, this should be the closest or most difficult matchup within this bracket. So as the number 4 seed, so the slight favorite, we have Dean Pelton versus Vice Dean Laybourne. So obviously that is contained within one season of the show. However, it was very impactful and very substantial within that season. Going up against it, we have the relationship of Jeff versus Rich, which, I mean, it's a 5 seed and probably the most contested bracket, but I would say just off the top of my head, one of my favorite relationships in this entire show. So we've got the 4, we've got the 5. Adam, I'm going to pitch it to you first. Where do you chime in on this matchup?
Well, you said it exactly right, when in theory this should be one of the toughest matchups, and it is. John Goodman came out of retirement from network television to play Vice Dean Laybourne. Let's start there.
I assume he was going through some things, but
he was going.
I don't want to get too far ahead of myself.
Absolutely. And it was really satisfying again to see John Goodman come back to network television. He was amazing. And this quarrel sets off any type of progress, professionally speaking, that we see the Dean make, because he comes in resolved to be different and things are going to be better this year. And that is immediately and emphatically squashed by Vice Dean Laybourne. And then it sets up the whole rift of Troy and Abed. Without air conditioner repair school and Weisstein Laybourne, we don't have, that great drama of the blanket and pillow fort. So I really, really love that. Jeff versus Rich is also incredible. And I was stunned to see that, Dave, that you had ranked this at 5. I would have assumed it was the 2 or 3 seed for you. And Rich is just all of the things that Jeff is not. And it gives us the payoff of this relationship, of this adversarial relationship, is that great scene where Jeff is running through the rain, and it's like the opposite of Jeff and Alan. This is Jeff and Rich, kind of shows how much Jeff has stayed the same and how manipulative he still is. So I can
go if you want to think about it. I can explain a little bit.
Go for it. Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. So, and then we can hop back, because I kind of want to build off what you were saying, where it's like, I guess I'll start Jeff and Rich, because that's and you were saying Jeff's even manipulative, and he manipulates Rich in that moment, which is also so funny to show how true those characters are, because you think they even talked about it in the commentary where they're like, oh yeah, they tried to set it up like Jeff is running to Annie, and nope, he's running to Rich. And He even points out where he's like, give me that power so I can abuse it. And he kind of like squints at him. He's like, you're being a real fuddy-duddy, or something like that, where he's like, yes, but you know that you're such a good person that you have to let me in and at least try and explain it to me. And I think to this day, I say it a lot where I go, you got me there, guy.
Absolutely.
Yep, you got me there, guy.
He's so happy and charming. And then with like the introduction of him in the pottery class, and just a great little one-off role by Tony Hale calling everybody blueberries, and like him being sexually attracted to Rich because he's so good at pottery. Like, I want to kiss you on the mouth. Like, and then even Jeff, and Jeff trying to manipulate him, where he's like, oh, I can't do pottery because I broke my finger. And Rich is like, oh, let me take a look. Oh, because you're good at pottery means you have a doctorate? No, because I have a doctorate means I'm good at being a doctor. And then even this is the brilliance of the Dan Harmon writing, where you get the thing at the very end of the first pottery episode where like you hear that monologue from his mom in his you see that like sinister turn. I'm like, oh man, that could have been so interesting.
And it's the complete opposite of Jeff's inner monologue. Like, he is the perfect foil to Jeff, even within his own inner monologue.
Also, well, let's not forget too, because Rich pops up in the zombie episode, and one thing you find out in the zombie episode is Rich is actually kind of a dick, and he takes Jeff's coat and stretches it out over the banana costume. Oh, sorry, I was just thinking about that as a sentence, like by itself, like zombie episode, banana costume, stretching out his coat. So yeah, it's one of those things. But I'm glad you guys brought up all the other stuff with Dean Pelton and Weisstein Laybourne, because I kind of forgot that it was Weisstein Laybourne kind of being the puppet master to get Troy into the school, and I forgot that that's where the rift starts between. It was like a little bit of those seeds that Weisstein Laybourne is planting. The only reason I ding that is because that's almost for selfish purposes, because that doesn't really play into Dean versus Weisstein. That plays more into Laybourne wanting Troy. And I was actually going to go back, because if we do the outliers as far as
I think there's a good chance that Troy versus Weisstein Laybourne may come up during the obscure region discussion.
So because I think you guys bring up a good point where it's Dean Pelton versus Weisstein. It's very good in that. And I also didn't put it together where the Dean actually had a goatee in the very beginning of that season. So new Dean, Weisstein, new Dean. And then the amazing, funny monologue that John Goodman gives, and Dean screams, I forgot everything you said before rectum, or after rectum. That kills me so much. And I mean, I guess I'll go ahead and make my decision, and we go to Adam. But I think you guys were right that I'm going Jeff and Rich. I think that's a better relationship. I think it pops up more. I think there are some more payoffs. And then you get you get Jeff having to defend Chang to the group to try to have Rich not come in.
Let him finish.
That was also one that I pitched, I think, just because I just remembered it, and if I would have remembered it when we were talking about it beforehand. But I think there was a study group minus Shirley versus Gary, and how everyone just hates Gary, but we never see him. I thought that was a great one too. But yeah, I go Jeff versus Rich in this one.
I had also written down number 5, Jeff versus Rich. So we are in agreement again.
This is crazy. I apparently this may have been underseeded. I don't know. I also kind of feel mostly vindicated that this is probably going to be the most contested matchup of this round, but we shall see. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. We have the number 2 seed, which we have Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck, and I've heard a couple different ways to spell and pronounce this on the internet. I'm almost certain that I have the correct and canonical one here. Going
Spreck?
up against...
No, I think you're right.
Okay, going up against Pierce versus Cornelius, his father. So that's where we're at. We've got Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck from City College, and then we have Pierce going up against his father Cornelius. Dan, kick us off on this one. Where do you land on this matchup?
Sure. Talking a little bit about Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck, it's so curious to me because this is a very early one. I think this is mostly 1 and 2. I don't even think Spreck pops up in 3 except at the very end where they kind of tease him in that season 3 finale where there's a map and they're talking about doing like a takeover of Greendale or something where it looks like he's playing Risk, but it's with Greendale. Spreck is amazing in the 2 episodes, the second 2 paintballs where you have the Western, you have the Star Wars, and him being under Pistol Patty, I think is the ice cream cone's name, which is really great. And I also like Spreck being the foil as well in where they're trying to do a race to see who can have the simulator into space first. And that was like a huge deal with the KFC space simulator that they have. And that's pretty much a direct Dean Pelton versus Spreck episode. And there's a great part in the commentary where they talk about they like to imagine that all of the deans of community college in this city are just all somewhat genderless, like effeminate men that are like skinny, like because they do very much look like foils of one another and almost act that way too. And how Dean Pelton kind of melts when Spreck starts whispering in his ear, and there's a runner of Dean Pelton like getting kind of aroused by power where he does it in the zombie episode too, where they were like, is this Dean Pelton? And he's like, speaking. He's really into it. But all that being said, the Pierce versus Cornelius, I think for me, I'll go ahead and tip my hand. For me, this is going to be my first upset because Pierce versus Cornelius ties so directly into who he is as a core character, whereas like Pelton versus Spreck to me is like you see it a little bit in the show where it's almost like a professional rivalry where it's like these two have in some way, shape, or form they have a lot in common, and it's almost because they have so much in common that they're rivals, like that they kind of want the same things. They want their schools to be good. Whereas Pierce versus Cornelius, you can draw a direct line to who Pierce is as an individual in the entire show from how shitty his dad was at different points of his life. And like they have multiple episodes based on it. Like Advanced Gay is directly based on it. Digital Estate Planning, which is one of my favorite episodes in the whole thing, is like an 8-bit game just centered around Pierce trying to kill his father. And then you also get a foil with it where you have Pierce versus Cornelius, but you almost kind of have to talk about Jeff versus his dad because Pierce brings it up a bunch and shows it to Jeff. He's like, here, no, I'm going to hold a mirror up to you because you have issues with your father as well. And Jeff kills his father. So it's like he literally killed a man and you get to see that on screen. For me, I think that relationship and that versus is tied more into the fabric of the show and definitely the fabric of those two characters. So that's where my vote goes for this one.
You can definitely see there's 2 points in time where I feel bad for Pierce as a character. And one of the times is when you see the video footage of him getting recast as Cornelius's son for Hawthorne Wipes. And it's in that moment you think, gosh, he's easy to dislike. He's easy. He says all these terrible and bad things about all sorts of people. He's not nice. And then for a moment there, you say, gosh, I have been lacking empathy for this character because I didn't understand where he came from. Mm-hmm. So that's a really powerful scene, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think that certainly speaks to your point. The reason why I'm going to pick number 2, the 2 seed, Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck, is only because there are a lot of characters who have quote unquote daddy issues in the show. The Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck is different. It's interesting. And to me, there's just something really hilarious about 2 community college deans playing chess to figure out parking spots and competing against one another and trying to sabotage one another. And it's emblematic of their institutions in general just being, and it really highlights how silly rivalries are in the first place, based on geographic happenstance in this case. And I also love that the actor who plays Dean Spreck, his name is escaping me. No, Jordan Black. Jordan Black is his name. So he and Jim Rash had worked together with, there's a theater called The Groundlings. So they had worked together previously, and you can really tell that they've got a lot of chemistry when they act for all of the reasons that you outlined, Dan. So for me, just the novelty of I've never seen a show where two deans of community colleges have had a rivalry, but I've seen a lot of different cases where someone has issues with their dad, and even if it is so edible.
So edible, you're the worst.
Let's not Brita this entire thing. So when I was doing the bracket and I was coming up with the seedings, there were a lot of situations where we could have gone into different members of the study group versus their mother or their father, we even talked about Britta versus both her parents in the first matchup. However, I thought that Pierce versus Cornelius was the pinnacle of those one-on-one versus a mother or father relationships. And that's why it was included in the 8 relationships that we're discussing right now. That being said, I definitely did the seedings purely based off gut instinct, very much willing to be swayed. But I think I'm going to go with the number 2 seed. We're going to advance Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck.
Well fought.
Absolutely. Let's see how far it goes, though, because it's going to go up against the winner of this next matchup, which is the final matchup in our first round, and that is the number 3 seed, Chang versus Duncan, going up against the number 6 seed, which is Dean Pelton versus Chang. And before I pitch it to Adam here to get started on this, I will say that certainly more so than any of the other brackets, like this one really let Chang and Dean Pelton shine and stick out. So the fact that they are going up head-to-head in this 6 seed is certainly something that is noteworthy. That all being said, Adam, where do you weigh in on this 3 versus 6 matchup?
So it's really interesting because Chang versus Duncan is almost exclusively season 1. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really go beyond that because
it comes back in like the end, though, doesn't it? Like seasons 5 and 6?
Not so much as an adversary, I don't feel like. Duncan agrees to bear down for midterms.
I was going to say, well, begrudgingly, though.
Begrudgingly,
that's true. He fights it at
first,
first and then eventually gets won over. So there's definitely some Chang versus Duncan conflict in season 5, even if
there's a little bit, but I think it's a little bit more like, at that point, it's almost more anecdotal, whereas like season 1, it's a B or a C story. It's much more front and center.
Yeah. And, the whole reason that happened is because the world couldn't bother to be deprived of John Oliver. So he had to go do non-community things, which may be net positive for the world, net negative for the show. So it's really funny. I love their back and forth, even into season 2 when Duncan has to teach anthropology and he's got the restraining order.
Yeah.
That's all pretty funny. But the back and forths of, hey, is there a word in Spanish that means someone who used to be a teacher but isn't a teacher anymore? And he says, oh, never mind. If it's in Spanish, you wouldn't know it. And that's really crisp, good, solid writing that I love from season 1. Excellent delivery by both. And I like that. I think, however, Dean Pelton versus Chang is a little more fascinating because it develops and changes and morphs over time. Initially, it's kind of like he's not ever directly bullied by Chang, but Chang gives off that persona when he's the Spanish teacher. He bullies everybody else. We have every reason to believe that, that's how he was allowed to stay as a professor, relying on Sesame Street language training in Spanish. And over time, it turns into that full overthrow. Dan had mentioned earlier, Warlord Chang. So even though I don't love that arc necessarily, I think that the rivalry of Dean Pelton versus Chang is maybe a little bit more interesting on the whole. So that's right now, my first version of the bracket. I picked Chang versus Duncan. Right now I'm waffling, and I'm going to go with the number 6 seed, Dean Pelton versus Chang.
I want to say, and actually, I'll go a little bit off script here because I want to hear, because I'm in the same thing. I want to go, I could go either way, but I kind of want to hear, Dave, I want to see you do a vote now, and then I'll be the tiebreaker. Let's switch it up for this one because I could go either way.
Format blown up.
Holy hell, did you really just yank my producer's privilege card?
I
just
did.
right here live in the recording.
Right here live.
Wow.
While we're recording.
Well,
it's so you did. I'll explain why I want to do it this way, because I could, much like how Adam just said, like he was waffling a bit and he could do it. My thoughts are going to be similar. So I want to hear what you did, because you did these seedings as well. So right now, to recap, Chang versus Duncan is 3, and then Pelton versus Chang is 6. So I kind of want to hear where your thoughts are, and if you want to vote, go ahead. And then if you don't want to, I can. But I kind of want to hear like where your thought process was for these two were.
I very much was in the mindset when I was seeding the bracket that I did put a lot of thought into which relationships, which dynamics should be included within the 8. However, once I had found the 8, I very much went straight just, off the gut in terms of seedings, and was very much willing to be swayed by good arguments on either side. So now that you've put me in the position to make the arguments, not be swayed by them, and having only heard Adam's argument, I think I'm going to be swayed by it. I am going to go against myself and go with the number 6 seed here. And I think that the reason I'm going to do that, and the deciding factor, is the one point Adam brought up, which is it's just a more interesting dynamic. I think Chang versus Duncan might have more laugh moments if we're just doing the math. However, I think that the Pelton versus Chang relationship actually is not only as, if not more entertaining, but is almost certainly more interesting as a dynamic. So I'm going to go against myself here. I'm going to go with Adam. I'm going to go with the number 6 seed. So I would like to hear your input. However, at this point, technically your vote doesn't matter.
Well, to spoil my hand, it would have been the same. It would have been Pelton versus Chang, because I think, for me personally, there's a bit more longevity to that, because you get that in literally all 6 seasons. Like, I don't even have to double check to know that there is conflict between those two in every single season. Like, I don't have to double check, because if those guys are in a room together, if they're saying anything to each other, like there's going to be conflict there. And I think how you were bringing up before, I think that has to do with how they structured the show with character roles and the dynamics, because they both initially came from positions of power, but then you see kind of what they do with their power, whereas Dean Pelton is like very bumbling, and then Chang like would love absolute power but does not know how to use it at all. So like we were talking about with Duncan, I think Chang versus Duncan has its moments, but I don't think it has as much staying power as Dean Pelton versus Chang does. And I also just remember that there was a great little throwaway joke in the Puppet episode where Troy goes, "Don't you guys think it's funny we haven't seen Duncan in like 4 years?"
That was one of my favorite parts of season 4.
Okay, so we have made it through the first round. And I have defied, you guys have defied my expectations. I have defied my own expectations. So I'm very excited for this next round of matchups here. Let's kick it off with the first one, which is going to be the number 1 seed, Pierce versus the study group, which we've already introduced. And then that's going to be going up against the number 5 seed, which technically upset the 4 seed in the first round and advanced. And that is the Jeff versus Rich rivalry. So I think, Dan, it's your turn to kick this discussion off. Where do you land on the the difference between Pierce and the study group and the Jeff Rich relationship?
These are both two. They have lasting arcs for both of these relationships. Pierce's study group, obviously much bigger just in terms of people, and then Jeff versus Rich in terms of multiple episodes, in terms of Jeff, how Jeff feels with Annie, about how Rich keeps popping back up into his life. And it's funny too, like we talked about earlier, how much Rich is a foil exactly for Jeff, where on the surface Rich is everything Jeff wants to be, like deep down, and almost vice versa, where like Rich has a really dark past and Jeff is kind of a tortured and broken human for most of the run of the show, and he's trying to hold it together. Which I will say, that's a highlight for season 4, where you get Jeff having kind of a big introspective monologue and talking to his dad. But I'm still going Pierce versus the study group, because the episodes you get out of it in season 2 and season 3 are just, they're next level. They're phenomenal. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is literally this exact storyline, which is Pierce versus the study group. You get that wonderful, breathtaking scene at the end of Paintball 3, which is him doing a monologue saying how he's been going to the school for over 10 years and hasn't been friends with anyone more than a semester. And like, even when you have the comedic bit of the ceiling tile falling, it doesn't break the tension. It's still just so palpable. So it's, for me, it's still Pierce versus.
Yeah, Pierce wins that episode. Just absolutely. Adam, where do you weigh in on this one?
Yeah, very similarly. But it was interesting as Dan was talking about Jeff and Rich as a foil. I kind of realized that with respect to how Annie views them, Jeff is a project, and there's nothing more she would love than to turn Jeff into Rich. And I'd never really seen it through that lens before. And, to an extent, Jeff wants to become Rich. And again, when you view that from the, to tip our cap a little bit in the next bracket, the Jeff and Annie of it all. So that's really pretty interesting and fascinating, too, when you think of it through that lens. That said, it's still Pierce versus the study group. There's so many different iterations of it. You see it implicitly, you see it explicitly, and it really is the biggest catalyst, I feel like, for this show in terms of all of the different drama that you end up getting from the show. The best of it comes from Pierce being bad guy. Again, I've got a soft spot in my heart for novelty in things I haven't seen before in network television, and that's top of the list.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys are in agreement on this. I would definitely join you in that agreement and in advance Pierce versus the City Group. So that being said, let's look at the second matchup in this round, and we now have the Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck relationship going up against Dean Pelton versus Chang. So very direct comparison here. Adam, where do you weigh in on this?
Yeah, no matter what happens, we're going to have some Pelton on Pelton crime here.
Yeah, for sure.
And I just want to go back to something that Dan said earlier, just, I assume with a straight face. I can't see his face, but just matter-of-factly was talking about how Dean Spreck dressed up incognito as a ice cream mascot with the explicit intent to destroy the school of his rival. That is
a lot of commitment.
It's the zaniest, most insane thing, compared to 99.9% of all network television ever. And
with $100,000 prize attached.
Right. So, we as community fans, we just take it in stride because, oh yeah, that's what happens. Right. But just like, I just wanted to go back and really reiterate how insane and wonderful that concept is, because you can't understate that. So that is what Dean Pelton versus Chang is up against, and I'm not sure it's up to the task. It's got more screen time for sure. Dean Pelton versus Chang. It changes, it adapts, and maybe that's a little bit more realistic in terms of how a rivalry could be. And we didn't mention, like in season 4, when Chang has Changnesia, there's a whole little bit of a rivalry there too, trying to suss out, is he faking it? Is it real? And Dean Pelton ends up trying to secure funding. So he ends up kind of like trying to use it. So again, it's a really pretty fascinating relationship when you take it beat by beat over 6 seasons. I'm just going to side in this instance with the big picture crazy zaniness that is Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck.
It's so interesting you bring that up because you just reminded me that you have a Pelton versus Spreck, and then you have a Pelton versus Chang, but there's actually a Venn diagram where in that season 4, Chang is literally working for Spreck. So there could even technically be a Spreck and Chang versus Pelton, but that's only for a couple episodes in season 4, I believe, where they show he is indeed thanking Changnesia. And then in season 5, he copped to his crimes, and then he's working as a math teacher, and he can't figure out the math of how far he can go away from his home censor because it's just classic Chang. And so, like you said, it's just such a great way, especially for the three of us who have just lived in this type of community and in this world, and we're like, oh yeah, it totally makes sense for him to dress up as an effeminate ice cream cone named Pistol Patty and then give away all this money. But in the same flip side of that coin, where you talk about Pelton versus Chang, you do have, when Chang becomes a warlord, he literally kidnaps the dean, hides him in a basement, and then replaces him with the Dienelganger. That's not what we said. We said doppelganger.
Or Phoebe, if you will.
Phoebe, exactly, played by J.P. Minogue. And the
Who is
reason
on
I know
Cameo, by the way, just throwing that out there.
funny you bring that up. Actually, a good friend of me and my wife actually sent us a cameo from J.P. Minogue for a wedding present.
That's great.
So, it was phenomenal.
And it came up organically.
Yeah, and it came up organically. But no, so yeah, we actually, and he referenced JP to start off the cameo. He goes, Dean, 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 Dean. And I'm like, oh, that's so nice. And that he did that. And it was a great job. And it was a fantastic gift. Anyway, but to tip my hat a little bit, so I like the Pelton versus Spreck. And like it goes through, I guess through 4 seasons. We don't really see Spreck in seasons 5 and 6. I still think for me, I have to go Pelton versus Chang because I think, Adam, you alluded to it a little bit earlier that story arc of Chang taking over the school isn't your favorite. That is one of my favorites. And because that's where I like that conflict more, especially because you get to the Ocean's 11 episode, you get to a Star Wars homage fight where they both have tasers with Chang and Jeff, which is still kind of in a roundabout way with Pelton as well because they have to kidnap him back. So I go Pelton versus Chang. So we're gonna make Dave come in and be a tiebreaker.
You guys have both made very convincing cases, and well, I've certainly heard and am very much in tow with the idea that the Pelton versus Chang relationship is more thorough. It's certainly deeper. It goes throughout the entire length of the show. The Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck relationship, to me, is a relationship that doesn't have any lows. And while it might not cover the same breadth that the other relationship does, it's all highs. It's all highs. Whereas the Dean Pelton versus Chang relationship, while it might be more thorough, longer lasting, more in depth, it's got a lot of lows in it, too. A lot of my least favorite episodes of the show, and, we haven't gone deep into it yet, but just on some things we touched on last episode, Dan, I think you and I very much disagree on the back half of season 3.
Probably.
The Dean Pelton versus Chang relationship has a lot of lows for me. A lot of lows that I never even get close to when I am experiencing the Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck relationship. So even though off the top of my head I did have that higher seated, having heard both sides, I'm even more committed now than ever that I really think the Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck relationship goes on here.
That's fair. I accept defeat again. The only 2 things I just remembered while you're talking about, I think it's in the same scene or very similar scene where he first shows up as a security guard and he's trying to do, I think he was pouting, where it's like, I don't know who told you pouting works for you, but all you're making me feel is a hatred for Renee Zellweger.
Yeah.
That line is amazing. And then the one a few minutes later where Chang goes, you won't regret this unless I rise up against you. And then he laughs like, I don't know why I said that. So before we completely get rid of that, which, we're moving on, but I just remember those 2 things and they made me very happy.
No, I love the relationship. I'm going to go with the 2. I didn't mean for this to be chalk, and hopefully or potentially the other regions won't come down to the 1 versus the 2, but that's where we are right now. So Pierce versus the study group is going up against the Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck relationship. How do we sort this one out? Where do we start here?
I don't think it's going to surprise anybody that I'm sticking with the one I've been going through the whole time. I don't mean to keep railing against Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck. It just keeps coming up that way, that I'm liking the other ones more than all the other ones, the competitors. But I do think Pierce versus the study group, I think you don't get most of the great arcs and the great rivalries in seasons 1 through 3.5, because he pops up in like half of season 4, but not a lot of it. And Pelton versus Spreck, as much as you guys make amazing points, and as much as I like it as like the school actually having something to fight for, I find the infighting of Pierce versus the study group to be more entertaining, if that makes more sense.
Again, if we think about this in a basketball terminology in honor of brackets, this is where the 2 seed has a weakness that has not been exploited by the other matchups so far. But Pierce versus the study group really highlights how there's a lack of longevity, there's a lack of screen time, there's a lack of payoff associated with Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck because it doesn't have that weakness at all. And to all the points that we've been saying all along, Pierce versus the study group, I believe, is significantly better than Dean Pelton versus Dean Spreck.
You know what you just made me realize? I think Spreck in the later seasons, it seems almost like they replaced the character or the conflict of Dean Spreck with the guys from the school board. That's very much how it feels to me.
Yeah, I can totally see that. I'm not sure how I reminded you of that, but I'm glad that it happened.
Well, it's because that's where the Spreck character kind of naturally ends, which is at the end of season 3 and a tiny bit into season 4. But then the less he shows up, you start getting more Richie and I thought I could pull both their names.
Carl.
But I only pulled Richie and Carl. Yeah, and I didn't even think to pitch them. They would have been a great one to talk about as well. Like Richie and Carl versus Greendale would have been really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad we've come full circle there because, like we started out on the discussion of this region, there were a lot of different ways we could have gone here, and more so than any of the other regions that we are going to discuss, this region had a lot of subcategories, whereas the nature of the relationships in the platonic bracket, in the romantic bracket, there are a lot of similarities between those relationships. It's just kind of the players, the names, the variables change, but the function is the same. However, in this bracket, it almost came down to a discussion of how we valued the different natures of the rivalries within this category. And so I think that's why ultimately Pierce versus the study group emerges victorious here, because as much as there were a lot of other great rivalries in the show, this was the one that really started to help and continue to define the show. So we may not end up with the one seed in the other brackets, but I think we've sussed this one out pretty thoroughly. And you guys have both made really compelling cases that we should advance Pierce versus the study group into the fearsome foursome of this year's tournament. All right, that is going to do it for the Rivalry Region and today's episode. 6 seasons in a bracket will continue in just under 2 weeks, where we will be tackling the next regional, this one focusing on the romantic relationships in the show community. As always, you can listen to Apartment 303 on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. For Dan and Adam, this is Dave signing off. We will see you in the next episode of Apartment 303.